The Sherlock Holmes Advent Calendar. An Odyssey to Jerusalem. By Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Bryan Godwin. Part 14. The Wall. Holmes had to maltreat Salah's front door several times, and quite vigorously at that, until we heard our Muslim colleague answering the door in a very monotonous and dead-tired voice. "Who is knocking at my door at such an unearthly hour?" But when he realized that it was us, he was suddenly wide awake. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson!" he shouted excitedly. "There you are again, God be praised, and I had already feared the worst. I had the whole city searching for you. What happened, and where have you been? Oh, where are my manners? Do come in first." We entered and followed Salah into the living room area with the floor seat cushion, where we settled down without being asked. "We were in the Jordan Valley," Holmes explained, "and for some time across the river, but that's a long story." Only now our host noticed the state we were in. "You look terrible, gentlemen. If you contaminate my seating seat, it will be me who has to stand up for it in front of Miriam. I suggest you wash yourself, change clothes, and then calmly tell me about your trip." Our clothes, as well as ourselves, had indeed come into contact not only with the mud of the riverbed, but also with the sand of the semi-desert between Jericho and Jerusalem, not to mention the physical strains. We weren't exactly put together neatly and probably smelled like a whole herd of camels. In short, we accepted Salah's proposal, and not in his interest only. As soon as we cleaned up, we sat back on the floor cushions. As the sun was rising, we sat there feeling refreshed, reporting in detail what had happened at Mount Zion and the Jordan River. Salah had listened attentively and asked the one or other question. When we finished, he said, "You were lucky, gentlemen. Your lifeless bodies could now also be buried somewhere in the desert or floating in the Dead Sea. You should take the kidnapper's threats seriously." "We do too," I replied, "but we will not back down from our mission. If this was what they were aiming for, then they clearly missed. We are determined." Holmes thought for a moment and then said, "I don't think the perpetrators are so naive to seriously expect us to surrender and depart. Rather, it must have been their primary interest to keep us away from Jerusalem for a period of time. It was certainly clear to them that we would come back dutifully. In this respect, this assumption correlates with my earlier assessment that the terrorists are planning a major attack. To carry it out, they needed a free hand in the city, no annoying investigators who would be on their heels. It must therefore now be assumed that the action in question is imminent." "What are they possibly planning?" I interjected. "We should reckon with the unknown," Salah said in a worried voice. "It could be a new explosive or arson attack, but this time with fatal consequences. The grace period for human lives may be over. Once Turks lie dead on the streets of Jerusalem, the Ottoman government will lose patience." "But then the terrorists would have achieved the opposite of what they are aiming for," I replied. "Apparently they are concerned with shaking off the Ottoman yoke, as they probably see it. In fact, however, they will provoke a harsh intervention of the Sublime Porte, new and stronger repressions. That is not in the interest of these people." "Certainly," Holmes confirmed. "Terrorism may seem dysfunctional at times. On the other hand, martyrs can be conducive to a self-proclaimed struggle for freedom. If you want to create awareness of oppression among the population, they must first feel it." "And then?" I checked. "Then there is an uprising," Holmes continued. "The more brutally this is suppressed, the sooner one will be able to appeal to the major European powers and convince them that an intervention is necessary. At first, it might be political or diplomatic, and it could escalate to a military one." I sighed demonstratively. "Which brings us back to the Russians," I said. "Who else could be carried away at the international level to openly challenge Ottoman rule? The Germans are striving for an alliance, the French are doing good business with the Turks. Why would they put that at risk? The Austrians have enough to do with keeping their own country together. The Italians and Greeks definitely lack military combat power for adventurous war expeditions." "Have you thought of regional powers?" Salah said. "The Egyptian Khedives are lying between Constantinople and London, but undoubtedly seek independence from both and, of course, control of the Suez Canal. In addition, however, the Egyptians repeatedly make latent claims to Palestine or even to Syria. Or what about Qajar? In Persia, a new Shah has ruled for half a year after his predecessor was shot. Perhaps he is driven by expansionist desires. However, Persia is under the auspices of British and Russian donors. And the Russians again, I shouted. Maybe there is an international conspiracy against the Ottomans. Enough of that, replied Holmes. Our speculation on international politics merely distracts us from our actual task, which consists of investigative work on the site, and that is here in Jerusalem. When we get a hold of the perpetrator, they will tell us who they are allied to. So what are you proposing? Salah asked. Holmes demonstratively crossed his arms and proclaimed, "We shall wait." "Wait?" I replied in disbelief. "What for?" And the very next moment there was a loud knock coming from the entrance door. "On it," Holmes said with a satisfied expression. "Who might that be?" murmured Salah as he rose up to go to the door. Holmes also stood up and replied, "This will be one of your colleagues. He will inform you of the recent attack by the terrorists." Holmes was proved right. In front of the door stood an Ottoman security officer who seemed to be very nervous. While making extensive gestures, he told Salah in Turkish about a certainly disastrous event. And even our Palestinian partner seemed to be very shocked. When the messenger left, he turned to us. "Gentlemen, the situation is dire. There is no time to lose. We have to go immediately to the Wailing Wall." We were immediately ready to leave and move quickly to the southeast, crossing the Jewish quarter. On the way, I imagined various scenarios of the nature of the next strike. Probably the expected attacks on human targets had begun. Perhaps an army patrol had fallen victim to a booby trap. Or worse, innocent civilians may have been injured or even killed. Just imagine if a bomb exploded in one of the busy markets. Well, there would be a veritable bloodbath. These ideas contributed to me being even more tense and also somewhat stressed. At the crime scene, as an investigator and as a doctor, I would be highly challenged. Our path led us to the so-called Wailing Wall. It was the remaining remnant of the western perimeter wall on the Temple Mount, which supported the plateau of the Herodian Temple. The sanctuary itself had been thoroughly destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 AB during the capture of Jerusalem in the course of the Jewish War. This marked the Roman triumph over the uprising in Judea. The remaining rebels entrenched themselves in the rock fortress of Masada, when they were trapped and besieged by a Roman army. In a hopeless situation, the resistance fighters and their families committed collective suicide, another trauma in the history of Judaism, but also an act of determined resistance, albeit with a tragic end. Be that as it may, back to Jerusalem. The Jewish sanctuaries on the Temple Mount had been completely devastated by the imperial victors. Today, the area is reserved for Islam. In this respect, the Jewish believers had actually had nothing left but the western retaining wall to worship the site of the Second Temple, and this had to be done from below. In a cul-de-sac, barely 10 feet wide and 100 feet long, Jews gathered for prayer in front of the approximately 60-foot towering wall. Despite this considerable height, it is only a third of the original vertical size. Salah and the both of us made our way through the numerous people in the alleys and squares. He was not squeamish, and sometimes he acted as a human battering ram in order to progress faster. "We are now approaching the Moroccan Quarter," he told us. "At its eastern end, we come across the Temple Mount and the Western Wall." "A Moroccan Quarter?" I asked. "I thought there was only the Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and Armenian quarter." Holmes was also not happy with the information, but for other reasons. "That makes no sense, Salah," he protested. "4 quarters make up a whole. A size 1 unit cannot be divided into 5 quarters. That would be a mathematical nonsense. One would then have to correctly designate the parts as fifths. Elementary logic." "I told you that Jerusalem is different," Salah replied. "This also applies to mathematics and geography. In addition, the Moroccan quarter is only semi-official. It forms only a small sector, and many people consider it a part of the Jewish quarter." "I agree with that," Holmes interjected. "That makes the mathematics right again." "Nevertheless, the area distinguishes significantly," the Palestinian continued. Here live mainly Muslims from the Maghreb, North Africa, Arabs, Berbers, Moors, but also Sephardic Jews. Soon we will be there. We continued and finally reached our destination after a few minutes. What we found, however, was neither a bloodbath nor a conflagration. Rather, the terrorists had climbed a new level of creativity. A relevant part of the mighty western wall was covered with a large white canvas, with which had been apparently attached to the top and unrolled downwards. It was kind of a huge banner, and it contained a message. On the lower part, we could read the Latin saying, Sic semper tyrannus, thus always to tyrants, a statement attributed to Brutus in the course of the assassination of Julius Caesar. Above it was the drawing of an Ottoman dignitary who apparently supposed to represent the Sultan, and he laid tied up under a guillotine, helplessly at the mercy of the falling hatchet. Holmes and I were very surprised when we saw the banner. The corners of my friend's mouth twitched and he desperately wanted to go up, but he controlled himself and said only, "What a monumental work of art!" I turned to Salah and asked, "This is supposed to be the latest strike? A caricature and a Latin quote." "It is an assault," our colleague insisted, "a direct attack on the authority of the Sultan and Ottoman rule, and it's a threat. This undoubtedly falls under high treason." Meanwhile, a crowd had gathered in the alley, which of course assessed the whole thing differently. Those present cheered and laughed, clapped their hands, and repeatedly chanted the slogan, Sic semper tyrannus. "See," Salah continued, "the people are incited. They support the perpetrators, whether Jews, Christians, or Arabs. For them, the Sultan is not only a tyrant, but also a joke. The mood could tip in the direction of revolution." As much as I considered the banner at the Western Wall to be a mild form of protest, the Palestinian investigator was not entirely wrong. The message on the canvas was undoubtedly a threat, and certainly suitable for further inciting the inhabitants of Jerusalem against the Sultan and the Ottomans as a whole. Suddenly, the mood in the crowd changed, and they began loudly chanting and throwing insults. Certainly, some hearty insults were among them. Dozens of Ottoman soldiers had appeared. Meanwhile, on top of the wall, they removed the banner from its fortifications and slowly pulled up the kind of heavy cloth. It had to disappear immediately. The subjects should no longer see their ruler lying under the axe.